Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and today we're continuing our Zhuge Ke's Regency Let's Talk Lore series with episode 4, titled The Final Siege of Hefei. Before we get started, here's the answer to our trivia question from the end of our last episode, and be sure to stay tuned until the end of this episode for a brand new trivia question. Now last time we ended with the Battle of Dongxing, where the Wu reinforcement surprised and overwhelmed an undisciplined, overconfident, and ultimately careless Wei force led by generals Hu Zun, Zhuge Dan, and Sima Zhao. As a direct result of this defeat, the Wei court under Sima Shi was put into a tough position of assigning blame for this failure. As we mentioned before, Hu Zun was closely aligned with the Sima clan, and in a time when the Sima clan's grip on the entire Wei court was not as strong following Sima Yi's recent death, Sima Shi really didn't want to punish Hu Zun and demote him out of the critical position in control of the eastern forces. So in the end, Sima Shi decided to throw his younger brother, Sima Zhao, under the bus to take the fall for this defeat, as Sima Zhao was the director of officers in charge of the entire attack, even though the defeat was largely caused by Hu Zun's arrogance. In terms of punishment, Sima Zhao was stripped of all his nobility titles and temporarily sidelined from any future military operations. In the grand scheme of things, this was a rather light punishment, as the losses at Dongxing was so bad that the Wei side ran out of coffins for the fallen troops and had to suspend traditional Confucian customs of not allowing marriages in families who have lost someone during the 3 years mourning period, as the Wei court was worried that this policy would impact population and agricultural production in the Xu and Yang provinces for future generations. Meanwhile, on the Wu side, the grand victory at the Battle of Dongxing helped make a already popular regent in Zhuge Ke into a superstar. Emperor Sun Liang, under the guidance of the court, promoted Zhuge Ke to become the prime minister of Wu, the governor of both the Yang and Jin provinces, and the commander of all Wu's armies, and countless monetary rewards like gold, horses, and silk. However, with his newfound fame and glory also came a growing ego and a false sense of invincibility, as right after the winter of 252, Zhuge Ke started planning for a massive offensive campaign against Wei, requiring an army of 200,000 troops. Upon hearing the scale of Zhuge Ke's campaign, the Wu court immediately tried to talk Zhuge Ke out of the idea, as they argued that the kingdom simply cannot afford a campaign of this scale, especially right after the previous military campaign of reinforcing Dongxing, which finished just a month before, as both the troops and supplies needed much more time to properly recover. But Zhuge Ke would hear none of this, as he ended up writing a short essay explaining the need for this campaign against Wei. Now, this essay was very light on substance and very heavy on political ideology, as it's listed out here, and it's a bit too long for me to translate it word for word, but essentially, this made it hard for people to continue speaking up against Zhuge Ke's planned campaign, as you end up risking being casted as a traitor who did not support the kingdom of Wu. And when one of Zhuge Ke's close friends, in Nie, who was the administrator of Danyang at the time, tried to write a letter to talk some sense into his friend, Zhuge Ke ended up writing back to Nie that he should just read the essay to understand why your concerns are rather short-sighted and lack the long-term outlook necessary for the success of the kingdom of Wu. In short, no one was going to change Zhuge Ke's mind, and thus by March of 253, after contacting the Shuhan court about a coordinated northern expedition led by Jiang Wei on Wei's western front, Zhuge Ke mobilized 200,000 troops and marched for the Wei territories in Huainan. The mobilization alone would send shockwaves throughout the kingdom of Wu, as Wu citizens were caught off guard by the scale of the conscription required for this campaign, as the first murmurs of discontent against the regent Zhuge Ke started to bubble underneath the surface within Wu. Now, Zhuge Ke's initial plan here was to give a grand show of force by marching widely across the entire Huainan region to flex Wu's might to the Wei citizens living on the borders, to perhaps entice them, scare them, or coerce them into joining Wu. But Zhuge Ke's many generals argue that civilians tended to flee on first sight of war, so such a grand effort would yield very little results while costing them a ton of supplies and leaving them vulnerable across a very wide front. Instead, they argued that they could once again form a siege on the key fortification at New Hefei Castle, forcing the Wei court to send reinforcements and thus providing an opportunity for Wu's grand army to have a decisive open field showdown with the Wei forces. Zhuge Ke agreed, and the sixth and final siege of Hefei of the Three Kingdoms period would occur in 253, as this would become the biggest siege of Hefei in terms of manpower, with more than twice the number of troops even when you compare it with Sun Quan's biggest attempts. Now, while this might have been the case, I would argue that after a certain point, the extra manpower here actually doesn't convert to better sieges or siege results, especially in the case of a relatively small sized fortification such as New Hefei Castle that is built and designed just for war. For example, let's assume it takes only 10,000 troops to assault every side of the fort simultaneously, which I think is a fair estimate for New Hefei Castle, given that the long-standing defensive garrison size for it was a mere 3,000 troops. Then let's say the attacking side implements 3 shifts of 8-hour attacks to give continuous pressure on the fort, so that would require 3 units of 10,000 troops or 30,000. And then let's assume every unit gets 3 days of rest in between assaults, so that would mean you need 4 groups of 30,000 troops to achieve this proper cycle of rest, and that would total up to 120,000 troops to maintain a 24/7 non-stop assault on such a fort. Therefore, Zhuge Ke's army of 200,000 probably has the same effectiveness as Sun Quan's 100,000, and while there is no upside of having more troops, there are plenty of downsides as the extra manpower requires more supplies, creates more crowding in the encampments as the space around the fort is not growing any bigger, and most dangerously, creates more waste. Just imagine 200,000 people worth of daily excrement that has to be properly managed to not seep into the nearby rivers, as these same rivers are also the only fresh water source for the 200,000 troops. And then imagine the siege dragging on for 3 months because the Wei side had the perfect response. As you see, when Zhuge Ke's army started their assault on New Hefei Castle, the 3,000 strong Wei garrison defending the fort was led by a young officer named Zhang Te. While Zhang Te had the same surname as the legendary Hefei defender Zhang Liao, they were not related, and Zhang Te was a relatively unknown officer at this time, as he had previously conscripted for the Wei Central Army before being transferred for a brief deployment in the Eastern Forces under the command of Zhuge Dan, who was not impressed by Zhang Te's capabilities and was ready to send him back to the Central Army. But fortunately, around this time, Guan Qiujian was reassigned from the You province down south to the Yu province to take over for Zhuge Dan after his success in expanding the Wei territories in the Korean Peninsula, which we have previously discussed in our Guan Qiujian's Conquest of Korea Let's Talk Lore series, for those who are interested in checking that out. And just before Zhang Te was reassigned back to the Central Army, he caught the eyes of Guan Qiujian, his new boss, who was immediately captivated with his potential, as Zhang Te would be promoted to become the garrison commander here in Hefei by Guan Qiujian. And Zhang Te would not disappoint Guan Qiujian's belief in him, as under his command, New Hefei Castle withstood Zhuge Ke's attack for more than 90 days before a dirt ramp reaching the top of one side of the fort wall was finally completed by the Wu force, effectively breaching the fort. Now, before we get into how Zhang Te and New Hefei Castle would survive this breach, we need to pause for a moment to discuss what the Wei reinforcement forces were doing in these 90 days. When news of Zhuge Ke's massive attack on New Hefei Castle first reached the Wei courts back in March of 253, Sima Shi decided to assign his uncle, Sima Fu, as the general in charge of reinforcing Hefei, as he would hand him command of 200,000 troops to match Zhuge Ke, in addition to the power to summon Guan Qiujian and Wen Qin, who were regional commanders in this area around Hefei, as Guanqiujian was the prefect of the Yu province, while Wenqing was the prefect of the Yang province. Now, when Sima Fu and his 200,000 troops arrived in Shouchun in April of 253, Sima Fu went against the advice of his two top generals in Guanqiujian and Wenqing, who wanted to attack the Wu army right away. Now, the elder statesman, Sima Fu, who was already 74 this time, ended up telling his generals that in any siege, the attacking side must pay a heavy cost, so it would be best for them to wait and let New Hefei Castle do its job, and wear down the Wu forces before they launched their counterattack, as Sima Fu was certain that the siege on New Hefei Castle was just part of Zhuge Ke's plan to score an open field battle against the Wei forces at a time when the Wei morale was still low following their embarrassing defeat at Dongxing less than 5 months ago. So instead of sending reinforcements right away, Sima Fu ordered Guanqiujian and Wenqing's forces into defensive positions in the Yu and Yang provinces, as aside from sieging New Hefei Castle, Zhuge Ke's army did make small probing attacks on other strongholds in the area, as they did have excess manpower. But because of Sima Fu's defensive posture, these attacks will largely fail. Meanwhile, Sima Fu himself and his massive army rested and drilled in Shouchun for more than a month before they finally started mobilizing down towards Hefei. During this time, Zhang Te and the garrison forces at Hefei fought hard and suffered massive losses, as more than half the defenders had already died to either fighting or sickness from drinking contaminated water, as both the defenders and attackers got their water from the same river that ran through Hefei. And while the Wei losses were more than 50% of their total troop count, the Wu losses were also heavy in terms of absolute numbers, as sickness spread throughout the Wu camp, especially as the siege dragged into the summer month and the weather got hotter and hotter. Initially, various Wu officers tried to inform Zhuge Ke of the scale of the spreading sickness in an attempt to talk Zhuge Ke into retreating, but after Zhuge Ke executed a few mid-level officers for what he called spreading false rumors that damaged army morale, people simply stopped reporting to Zhuge Ke, who was growing more and more visibly upset with each passing day, as New Hefei Castle stood strong like an immovable thorn on his side. Then finally, after more than 90 days of sieging, the Wu forces finally completed a dirt ramp reaching the top of the outer wall of New Hefei Castle, and the fort was finally breached. But victory was not yet achieved, as apart from the thick outer walls, New Hefei Castle still had a secondary wall inside. But this wall was not as secure as the outer walls, and it seemed like just a matter of time before New Hefei Castle would finally fall. At this critical moment, the Wei garrison commander Zhang Te rode out of the city, signaling surrender, as he would ride alone to the Wu encampment to discuss the terms of surrender directly with Zhuge Ke. Once inside Zhuge Ke's camp, Zhang Te explained that he, as the commander of the Wei garrison, was ready to surrender the city. But there are still roughly 2,000 troops and civilians inside that are unwilling to surrender, because according to Wei laws, garrisons that surrender before defending for 100 days without seeing reinforcements will be treated as treason, where the families of the defenders would all be sentenced as traitors to the kingdom and be killed. Therefore, given that it's already been more than 90 days, if the Wu army could just spare them a few more days to give the appearance of a 100-day period, then everyone inside would be willing to lay down their arms and surrender. And in order to earn Zhuge Ke's trust, Zhang Te offered to leave behind his commanding seal with Zhuge Ke, which technically would give Zhuge Ke the commanding rights over Hefei garrison. Now, delighted by this offer, Zhuge Ke naively accepted Zhang Te's agreement to the ceasefire, as even with a weaker secondary wall, it would still take more than a few days and countless more casualties to take Hefei Castle by force. Generously, Zhuge Ke didn't even take Zhang Te's commanding seal, as after all, it was a pointless symbolic gesture that Zhuge Ke didn't need, and Zhang Te was allowed to return back to New Hefei Castle to inform the defenders inside of the agreed deal. Little did Zhuge Ke know that Zhang Te and the defenders inside had zero intentions of surrendering, as they merely wanted to negotiate a ceasefire to get a respite so that they can patch up and reinforce the secondary wall inside to continue their resistance. So now, with a ceasefire in hand, Zhang Te and his troops will work under the cover of the night to take apart buildings inside Hefei to get wooden beams, stones, and brick to reinforce the secondary wall, and even constructed a rudimentary tertiary wall to fall back to. And by the next day, Zhang Te got on top of the city wall, cursed out at the Wu army as he declared that there is no surrender, as he and the defenders inside were willing to die with the city. Knowing that he had been tricked, Zhuge Ke furiously ordered for the assault to continue, but by this point it would yield little results, as the Wu army was simply too fatigued and demoralized at this point, especially after knowing they had been played. With no progress in sight, General Zhu Yi tried to steer Zhuge Ke towards a different target instead of continuing their fruitless siege here at Hefei, only to get an angry rebuttal from Zhuge Ke. Equally frustrated with the situation, Zhu Yi ended up throwing Zhuge Ke's written command to the ground and cursed out at Zhuge Ke for being a fool to not listen to him, which immediately triggered Zhuge Ke to strip Zhu Yi of his command, as Zhu Yi would be shipped back to Jianye to await punishment. Now, Zhuge Ke didn't execute Zhu Yi on the spot, mainly because Zhu Yi hailed from the esteemed Zhu clan of the Wu commandery, with his late father Zhu Huan, a former governor, and his late uncle Zhu Ju, a former prime minister of Wu, and a son-in-law to Sun Quan. So through these relationships, Zhu Yi got to keep his head. But this move still rubbed the rest of the Wu officers the wrong way, as not long after, Lieutenant Cai Lin, who had also been trying repeatedly to offer new strategies to Zhuge Ke with no avail, finally decided that the campaign was hopeless, and out of fear that Zhuge Ke would punish him, he and his unit decided to flee north to surrender to the Wei forces in the Yang province. And with Cai Lin's surrender, Sima Fu finally got the confirmation about the poor state of the Wu forces, and after nearly 2 months of rest, the Wei army finally begun their counterattack, with Sima Fu, Guan Qiujian, and Wen Qing pressing nearly 300,000 troops together at Zhuge Ke's now battered, sickly, and demoralized force. And not surprisingly, the Wu army outside Hefei shattered as troops routed left and right, with many falling into ditches constructed for the siege, and many more outright surrendering to the Wei force. Zhuge Ke ordered for the sick and injured to be abandoned as he took what remained of his army and retreated out of Hefei, embarrassed and defeated in what would become the greatest loss in Wu history, as while Sun Quan had more embarrassing showings at Hefei, the number of casualties caused by Zhuge Ke's attempt is simply unmatched. Now, with such a hefty defeat, a heavy price must also be paid, as we'll come back tomorrow to conclude our series when we look at the aftermath of Zhuge Ke's defeat at Hefei in episode 5, titled A Fall from Grace. So hopefully y'all have enjoyed this episode enough to consider subscribing to the channel for more content on Three Kingdoms history, or simply support the channel by leaving a comment below, or just by hitting the like button. And as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye!